Imagine this scene. A notorious robber, wanted in several states, appears on the street in broad daylight. People recognize him and say hello. He tips his hat and says, "Hey, how's it going? I'm gonna rob the local bank." His companions wish him luck and shout, "Go get him!" And no, this isn't a scene from a comedy movie. It's a real story from the life of a very real person. His name was Charles Floyd, but you may also have heard of him as Pretty Boy Floyd. His name has been shrouded in rumors and legends, and it is sometimes impossible to separate fact from fiction. Who was Charlie Floyd? A ruthless killer or the Robin Hood of the Great Depression? How did an ordinary farm boy become famous throughout the United States? How did one of the most wanted gangsters manage to give a real interview? Here, you will learn all this and much more. Meet Charles Pretty Boy Floyd on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance and enjoy your viewing. Charles Arthur Floyd was born on February 3, 1904, the second son and fourth child of Walter and Mamie Floyd. This took place in the community of Folsom in Bartow County, Georgia, where the family had lived for generations. As a baby, Charlie suffered from severe pneumonia, but survived. He grew up in a typical early 20th century southern backwater, in a farmhouse ruled by a strict father and a devout mother. Shortly after Charlie's birth, the family moved from Folsom to Addersville. And in early 1911, when Charlie was 7, the Floyds decided to leave Georgia altogether. Although politicians and the media were predicting a revival of the South at the time, Walter thought the process was too slow. Charles's father decided that a better future awaited them outside the state and set his sights on the West. Walter initially considered Texas, but then settled in Oklahoma, a state with fertile land. The deciding factor was that the members of the Floyd family and some of their friends already lived there. After selling their house and livestock, the Floyds said goodbye to Georgia and boarded a train. Their destination was the town of Hanson in Sequoyah County, Oklahoma, where an unpleasant surprise awaited the enthusiastic family. The fact was that in 1910, there had been a fire there. Relatives warned Walter about this, but he only realized the full extent of the problem when he saw the charred foundations and empty houses with his own eyes. But Charles's father did not give up. Walter rented land in the nearby hilly region of Cookson Hills and took up farming. Gradually, he acquired horses, cows, and poultry. The Floyds began growing cotton, corn, hay, and sorghum in their fields. And of course, all the children were actively involved in the work. It was here that Floyd committed his first crime. Charlie was 10 years old at the time and stole some cookies. He was caught in an alley near a store while eating his loot. Nothing bad happened to the boy in the end. He was lectured on the evils of stealing and let go. However, Charlie learned his lesson and was never caught again. In 1916, the Floyd family moved from Hanson to Aikens, another farming community. Once again, the Floyds easily integrated into local life. They grew crops and raised livestock and poultry. In addition to working on the leased fields of Cookson Hills, Walter moonlighted as a road worker and sold moonshine. By the time he was a teenager, school had lost its appeal for Charlie, as his path in life already seemed predetermined: farming, making moonshine, church, and a quiet family life. Those around him did not expect anything more from him. However, Charlie himself had other plans. He longed to see city streets, well-groomed and fashionably dressed girls, and an easy life with all the benefits of civilization: elevators, bathrooms, electricity, and restaurants. Chalk Floyd, as his fellow villagers called him, dreamed of escaping the endless corn and cotton fields by the time he was 13. A little later, he actually threw down his hoe, packed his belongings, and left for the city to find work. Charlie headed west, working in the fields to save money for city life. In early 1921, his family learned that Charlie had settled in a cheap boarding house in Wichita, Kansas. Rumor had it that he was planning to train as a hairdresser, but if he ever started, he soon gave it up. In general, the Floyds knew little about Charlie's life in Wichita. It was one of the most mysterious periods in his life. All they understood when he returned sometime later was that he had clearly fallen into bad company, and they were right. Sometime in 1921, Charlie Floyd met John Callahan, a colorful character from Wichita who was known as one of the most successful fences and bootleggers in the Midwest. Floyd worked for Callahan for a while, helping him smuggle illegal alcohol. For those who don't know, Prohibition was in effect in the U.S. throughout the 1920s. However, Floyd didn't stay in Kansas long enough to get himself into serious trouble. There are no records of an arrest in the Wichita police reports. The old cops knew he was helping Callahan, but they didn't see him as a serious threat. In 1922, on the eve of his 18th birthday, Floyd returned home to Oklahoma for some reason. His family was happy to see him, and everyone enjoyed listening to his stories about adventures. However, they couldn't help but notice how their Charlie had changed. He now looked at life differently. His dreams of success in the big city had evaporated, but the prospect of returning to the farm did not appeal to him. Back where he started, Charles tried to get his life back on track. However, only nighttime games of dice and poker brought in any income. Charlie had clearly picked up a few tricks from his friends in Wichita, which helped him compete even with experienced players, especially when they were relaxed after a few whiskeys. However, one day in May 1922, Charles was unlucky. His usually trusty tricks didn't work, and he lost everything. Floyd and his friends needed money to get back in the game, so they came up with an idea. At night, the boys broke into the local post office, got inside, and took jars filled with money for postage stamps. They pulled the jars out through the window and quickly disappeared, thinking that what they had done was nothing more than a bit of fun. It was dark, and they couldn't count how much they had stolen. However, the amount they stole was over $350, a significant sum for most people at the time. Needless to say, the next morning, news of the robbery quickly spread throughout the town and surrounding farms. When Charlie's gang realized what they had done, it was too late to fix things. In a panic, the young men decided to get rid of the evidence and threw the money into a well on the property belonging to Chalk's grandfather, Charles Murphy Floyd. However, the local police didn't need to be geniuses to figure out who had committed the theft. Charlie and his friends were the prime suspects from the start. What they had done was a serious crime involving the theft of money from a U.S. federal institution, so the local authorities called in federal agents. Fortunately for Chalk, his father managed to find common ground with the agents who arrived, who, like him, were Mormons, and provided his son with an alibi. This time, punishment was avoided, but it shook Charlie up quite a bit. After the incident, he became more moderate in his games, and he didn't have time for fun anyway. A romantic period was about to begin in Charles Floyd's life. He set his sights on Ruby Hargraves, a 17-year-old girl from a similarly poor farming family. And Ruby reciprocated his feelings. After several months of dating, it turned out that the girl was pregnant. And Charlie, who was living with his brother Bradley at the time and earning a meager living in the fields, did not lose his head and decided that marriage and fatherhood would help him settle down. He and Ruby went to the Sequoia County Courthouse and obtained a marriage license. A month later, they had a modest wedding. 6 months after that, on December 29th, Ruby gave birth to a boy. Charles named him himself, ignoring everyone else's objections. His first name was Charles, after his father, and his middle name was Dempsey, after the boxer once admired by young Chalk. Most of the Floyds later simply called the boy Dempsey. All these events certainly made Charles happy, but the celebrations were temporary, and he had to provide for his new family. In the spring of that year, Charlie, his father, and his older brother prepared their fields for planting cotton, and then sowed corn. But Charlie was not destined to harvest the crop, nor was he destined to celebrate Christmas with his relatives. Shortly after Ruby and Chalk celebrated their first wedding anniversary, he was once again overcome with anxiety. He loved his wife and little Dempsey dearly and didn't want to leave them, but he felt they deserved better than he could give them working on the farm. He made up his mind, packed his things, and told his family he was going away to work again. Perhaps back to Kansas or even Missouri. Charles dreamed that his wife and son would have everything they wanted. All this time he worked as hard as anyone else, but as Ruby later recalled, they hardly ever saw any money, while the neighboring boys had plenty. Charlie refused to accept this. He left, and after a while, Ruby began receiving money from him with no indication of where it came from. Charles's acquaintances said he had found work in the fields, but Ruby knew that wasn't true. No one could earn that much money in the fields so quickly. Truth was that in the fall of 1925, Charles Floyd left Cookson Hills, taking with him photos of Ruby and Dempsey, as well as a gun with a mother-of-pearl handle that he had gotten from his friend's father for 5 gallons of moonshine. Soon he was joined by a traveling companion of dubious reputation named Fred Hildebrand, nicknamed the Sheik. With no money in their pockets, Charlie and Fred hitched a ride on a freight train from Oklahoma to Missouri, where they occasionally met vagrants who shared their food with them, saving them from starvation. Charlie and Fred made their way through the Ozark Mountains to St. Louis, spending several days in that city before turning back. Returning to their home region in September, the two immediately attracted a lot of attention and suspicion. The young men who had left almost penniless returned in a brand new Studebaker. They smoked expensive cigars and were dressed in fashionable suits and hats. All they needed was to wear signs saying "bona fide outlaws" to make the truth completely obvious. One of the first to see them was Deputy Sheriff Burt Cotton, who knew all the Floyds well and was friends with them. Cotton immediately sensed something was wrong and, together with Police Chief J.C. Wall, stopped the Studebaker to question Chalk and his friend. Charlie and Fred tried to get away with vague explanations, but it didn't work. Cotton found 2 bundles of cash, each containing $1,000, all in bank envelopes from the Tower Grove Bank branch in St. Louis. Soon, Charles Floyd and Fred Hildebrand found themselves in jail in Sallisaw. By evening, rumors of Charlie's return and serious trouble reached his relatives. The next day, the police called Tower Grove Bank, where they were advised to contact St. Louis police. A conversation with colleagues clarified the situation. It turned out that on Friday, September 11th, 3 armed men had attacked bank couriers in the aforementioned city, stealing $12,000 in wages intended for a local company. On September 16th, Charlie Floyd and his alleged accomplice, accused of robbery, were sent back to St. Louis for further questioning. It was a sad day for the Floyd family. This time, Walter was unable to help his son. As his brother's wife recalled, on the day of their parting the train station, Chalk's hands and feet were bound with heavy chains. Although he tried to joke, everyone could see that he was seriously scared. Soon the train arrived and the police and prisoners boarded. At that moment, Charlie probably realized that his life would be divided into before and after. He was no longer a free country boy and family man. From then on, Charles Floyd was a criminal. On September 17, 1925, a train from Sallisaw took him to St. Louis, where Charles and his friend were put in jail. The intense interrogations that had begun in Sallisaw continued. Chalk stubbornly denied his guilt, but Fred Hildebrand proved to be an easier nut to crack. He not only admitted his role in the September 11th robbery, but also named Floyd and a certain Joseph Halavati as his accomplices. Police officers arriving in the grocery store where Halavati lived found a suitcase containing the stolen $2,311. During questioning, Halavati confessed to his involvement in the robbery and said that he had met Hildebrand and Floyd in early September, where they also flirted with 2 local girls. After spending several months in prison, Charles finally appeared before the district court on December 8, 1925. His appearance there was merely a formality. Charles had long since decided to plead guilty and serve his sentence, which was known to both sides. What Charlie wasn't ready for was the sentence he received. The judge gave him 5 years in a state penitentiary in Jefferson City. Not so much for a robber, especially considering that his friend Hildebrand got 3 years more. But Charlie was terrified when he realized that he had 1,825 days ahead of him, thrown away into nothingness. The prison where he ended up held more than 3,000 inmates, and their numbers were constantly growing. Life there was a kind of game of survival. A 12-hour workday was the norm from both inmates and guards. Corporal punishment was an acceptable method of maintaining discipline. Resigned to the fact that he would spend the next 5 years in prison conditions, Charlie developed a strategy that allowed him to avoid additional trouble. He did not interfere in other people's affairs, was respectful to the guards, and avoided contact with rapists and informers. In prison, Charlie managed to work in the kitchen, in the workshop, and on the farm, and made many friends. Overall, he left a good impression, but he was no saint. His prison record included 1 incident of assaulting a guard, and there are also rumors that he was involved in drug dealing. Like many of his colleagues, Charlie learned some lessons from his time in prison. And we're not just talking about rethinking his values, but a few practical skills too. There were a lot of experienced robbers, burglars, and other crime professionals in prison. Floyd was happy to listen to their advice on various topics and learn from their experience, so to speak. There was no good news from the outside world. Charlie learned from his mother and other relatives that his father was deeply disappointed in him. However, that was nothing compared to how his wife reacted to the situation. Other inmates warned Floyd that women will only wait for you a few months. Charlie didn't want to believe it, but the facts spoke for themselves. Ruby's letters became colder and less frequent. By the end of his sentence, Charlie was only receiving letters from her lawyer, and the correspondence was strictly business. Ruby wanted a divorce. For Charlie, the news was like a knife in the heart. He eventually agreed to the divorce, which was finalized in January 1929. Ruby was granted full custody of their son, Dempsey, who had recently turned 4. Did Charlie blame his new ex-wife for betraying him? No. Charlie was only angry at himself for putting her in that position. And although it seemed that his beloved family had finally fallen apart, Floyd still held on to the spark of hope and promised himself that as soon as he was released from prison, he would find Ruby and Dempsey and try to fix it all. He didn't have long to wait. Just a few months later, on March 7, 1929, the day of his release arrived. Leaving the prison behind, Charlie swore to himself that he would never return. He then headed straight to the train station and bought a ticket. Kansas City, where Floyd arrived, was a very lively place. Any self-respecting taxi driver knew where to take a customer to satisfy his desires for illegal booze, gambling, and women. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to let loose, but not for Charlie, who apparently couldn't take 2 steps without getting into some kind of trouble. It's unclear how Floyd managed it, but soon, just 2 days after his release, on March 9, 1929, he was arrested by the Kansas City police. It is unlikely that Charlie had time to do anything in such a short period of time. Most likely, he simply looked suspicious to the local law enforcement. Fortunately for Floyd, after a short stay in a cell, he was released with instructions to return to Oklahoma, where, according to police, he belonged. Kansas City was generally friendly to ex-convicts, but only if they had certain connections there. Not having any, Charlie left KC and headed south to Oklahoma. However, he did not plan to go straight to Aiken. Charlie knew that his brother Bradley had moved his family further west to the Seminole oil fields, where he was headed. Bradley wrote to Chalk about the rapid development of the oil industry and offered him a job, which wasn't a bad deal. Charlie was willing to give it a try, although deep down he dreamed of earning a living in an easier way. Bradley and his wife Bessie welcomed Charlie into their small home, where they lived with their 4 sons. Together, they all went to Aiken to visit his parents. Mamie was so happy to see her son that she cried, but Walter gave Charlie a very cold welcome. During a holiday dinner in his honor, Charlie learned the latest news about the Floyd's politics and family life. He also found out something about Ruby and his son, and he wasn't happy about it. His ex-wife's parents had moved north, and Ruby and little Dempsey had moved with them. But there was another problem. Ruby seemed to have found herself another man. After hearing the gossip, Charlie and Bradley's family returned to Earlsboro, where Chalk immediately went to the oil fields. He managed to find work as a handyman, but was soon fired, most likely because his boss heard rumors that his new employee was a former inmate. Floyd was disappointed. It was now clear that the path to a normal job was closed to him. He was sick of returning to farming, and he had no motivation to work in the fields. His wife and son were gone. After thinking it over for a while, Charlie came to the conclusion that he had only one option left, one that offered only a glimmer of hope. He decided to return to bootlegging and headed for Kansas City. His second visit to this bustling city was no better than the first, when Charlie, as you'll recall, was arrested for essentially nothing. On May 6, 1929, he was locked up on charges of vagrancy and suspicion of robbery. However, Charlie was released the next day and immediately headed west. On May 9, 1929, he was arrested in Pueblo, Colorado, again for vagrancy. The circumstances of his stay in Pueblo remain unclear. Charles claimed that he was just looking for work, but it's more likely that he was involved in transporting contraband alcohol from Kansas City to Pueblo. The Pueblo authorities, who had tightened measures against vagrants, fined Chalk $50 and sentenced him to 60 days in jail. After serving a sentence in Pueblo, Chalk rented a room in Kansas City at the end of August 1929 and continued his bootlegging activities. And now, guess what happened to Charlie a couple of days later? Right. On September 2nd, he was arrested again in Kansas City. This time he gave his name as Joe Scott and was soon released, but on September 17th, he was detained again and questioned about the robbery of the Sears Roebuck & Co. factory, though when Chalk's alibi got confirmed, he was released. Thus, in the 6 months since his initial release, Charlie was arrested 5 more times without even trying. Once all the hassle with the arrest was over, sad news awaited Charlie in November. On the 14th, a drunk Walter Floyd got into a fight with his rival Jim Mills in Aikens over a dispute about building materials. When Walter ran out into the streets, Mills, who later claimed he thought Floyd was going to get a gun, pulled out his pistol and shot Walter at point-blank range. The court, at which Charlie was also present, found Jim Mills not guilty. Shortly thereafter, Mills left Aikens. When Charlie Floyd became known as a notorious criminal several years later, many recalled this incident and concluded that he had avenged his father's death by killing Mills. Proponents of this theory even found an abandoned well where Floyd may have hidden the body. However, researchers are now almost 100% certain that these are just rumors. Mills actually moved to the West Coast, where he died at a much later age. After burying his father, Charles Floyd returned to Missouri, where he continued to build connections in the crime world. It was then, in the late 20s, as the bootlegging era was coming to an end, that Charles Arthur Floyd earned the nickname Pretty Boy, which would go down in history. The nickname was given to him by Beulah Baird when she first met him in Kansas City. Charlie Floyd met Beulah Baird Ash at a card table in the home for her mother-in-law, Sadie Ash, who willingly rented homes to various outlaws. Floyd, who was well-dressed and had made money bootlegging, caught Baird Ash's attention. She brought him a beer and called him Pretty Boy, after which luck followed Floyd in the card game. Although he did not like the nickname, it stuck and became part of his image. In Kansas City, Floyd not only made friends but also enemies, the latter being far more numerous. According to the memoir of his friend, James Henry Odette, Floyd was very popular with local girls. Among his girlfriends were prostitutes who had to pay bribes to some police officers in order to continue their professional activities. Floyd, like a true gentleman, decided to stand up for them and relieve them of unnecessary payments, which clearly did not add to his standing with the cops. On top of that, some prominent Kansas City detectives noticed Charles in the company of suspicious criminal figures and began to watch him, and some of the law enforcement officers, such as Captain Thomas Higgins, even tried to set Charlie on the right path. Needless to say, nothing came of this endeavor. In short, Floyd gradually got himself into a situation where he was opposed by both corrupt and honest police officers. Well, at least the local honeys loved him. When the pressure from the Kansas City police became unbearable, Charlie finally gave in to the persuasion of his prison buddies, James Bradley and Bob Amos, who urged him to leave town and look for a more lucrative business elsewhere. After compiling a list of banks in the East that seemed like easy targets, they asked Floyd to join them. For Charlie, who had grown up on stories about Jesse James and Henry Starr, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. So, in early 1930, Charlie Floyd and his crew set out on a reconnaissance mission. Leaving Kansas City, they drove through several Midwestern states and settled in a rented bungalow in Akron, Ohio. On the way, Charlie, James Bradley, and Bob Amos were joined by other criminals, among whom we can only name for sure a robber called Jack Atkins from Toledo, Nellie Maxwell, a shoplifter from Kansas City, also known as Nellie Denny, and Marie Maxwell, also joined their team, taking on the role of housekeeper. First on the gang's list was the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Sylvania, Ohio. On February 5, 1930, the robbers' car stopped in front of the bank building. Charlie and his 4 accomplices were in the car. The criminals were well-dressed and unmasked. One of them stayed behind the wheel, while others headed for the bank, leaving 2 friends to stand guard at the entrance. Charlie headed to the back of the bank, while the last robber began to intimidate the staff. In the back, Charlie encountered the teller, John Ifland, who had already managed to slam the vault door shut and activate a lock that prevented it from being opened until 5 p.m. Upon learning this, Charlie threatened to kill the teller if he did not open the safe within 2 minutes. Witness accounts differ at this point. Some said that Charlie hit the banker on the head with his gun and knocked him to the floor, while others claimed that another robber did the beating. At this time, Charlie's friends tried to get other employees to open the vault, but thanks to Ifland's efforts, they too were unable to do anything. In the lobby, the other robbers held 2 customers, Chris Rumpf Jr. and his 82-year-old father, Chris Rumpf Sr., at gunpoint. In all the commotion, the robbers made a big mistake by lining up the bank employees in front of the windows facing Monroe Street. A worker at a gas station across the street noticed them and reported it to the station owner, who was also the bank's vice president. He turned on the alarm and told the operator to notify the sheriff and Toledo police. And so, while trying to solve the problem of the locked vault, the gangsters suddenly heard the sound of sirens and realized that now they had two problems. Charlie, who reacted faster than the others, shouted that it was time to get out of there, and grabbing some money from the cash registers, the robbers rushed to the exit and got into a car. The fire chief and his assistant rushed after them in a fire truck, grabbing a shotgun. They were unable to catch up with the robbers, but they managed to remember the car's license plate number and report it to the authorities. Going back to their hideout, the robbers divided the loot, which amounted to just $2,000. But that was only the beginning. They believed that next time they would get a bigger haul, and comforting themselves with this thought, the gang began planning a new robbery. However, the police would not just wait around, which led to the events of March 8, 1930. On this night, the police combed the area and discovered a group of suspicious individuals leaving the Gannon family's establishment. According to police reports, at around 1:30 a.m., Burt Walker, Bob Amos, Marie Maxwell, and Bertha Gannon left the establishment in a state of slight intoxication. They got into a car and drove away. Noticing the police cars following them and being under the influence, the driver swerved and crashed into an intersection. Officers arriving at the scene detained the driver and passenger, leaving the women unharmed. But then Burt Walker pulled out a gun, shot the officer in the stomach, and fled. The wounded officer was rushed to the hospital, where he died a couple of days later. His colleagues found the revolver that was presumably used to fire the shot hidden near Gannon's home. The police searched the place, and the evidence they found led them to the cottage where the gang lived. At around 5:45 p.m., 14 hours after the incident, a group of officers stormed the cottage. In one of the rooms, they found and arrested the wounded Burt Walker, Marie Maxwell, who was washing his wounds, and Charlie Floyd, who was trying to hide under the bed. Walker was charged with first-degree murder for killing the cop. During the investigation, it came out that Charlie and his buddies were involved in robbing the Sylvania bank a month earlier, so Floyd and Amos got charged too. Charlie was temporarily transferred to the Toledo prison. On November 24, 1930, the day he was supposed to appear before a judge, Chalk managed to slip out of the prison barber shop and join several visitors leaving the building. He had almost left the prison grounds when he was caught by an officer who was walking in the opposite direction. After failing to escape, Charlie went to the courtroom and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years behind bars. For Floyd, who had sworn never to go to prison again, it was a complete disaster. The day came when Charles Floyd was to be transferred to a correctional facility in Columbus, Ohio. On December 10, 1930, Floyd and other prisoners were put on a train. When the train was near the town of Kenton on the Scioto River, Floyd managed to free himself from his chains, taking advantage of the carelessness of the guards, who were either playing cards or sleeping. Then Charlie jumped up, broke a window, dove through the hole, and disappeared. We know what happened next from Charlie, who 2 years later, while on the run, gave an interview to Oklahoma journalist Vivian Brown. Here is what he told her. "Instead of jumping up and running, I lay as still as I had ever been in my life and tried not to breathe. Several times, the guards almost stepped over me. I could have reached out and grabbed one of them, but luck was on my side, and the night was dark. They walked along the path, and I crawled into the reeds and sat there watching them. After dawn," Charlie recalled, "I went to the farmer's house, took his gun, and made him drive me away." Floyd traveled mostly at night, hitching rides. He preferred back roads through small towns in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. Despite wanting to spend Christmas with his family in Oklahoma, Floyd immediately headed to Kansas City to find a partner. That winter, Willis Miller became that partner. Unlike Burt Walker and others Floyd had known in Toledo and Akron, Miller was younger than Floyd. He grew up in Ironton, Ohio, and was known for his cruelty. A notable episode in the biography of Miller, nicknamed Billy the Killer, was the murder of his own brother Joseph in a shootout over a woman. Miller was tried for murder but acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. Nevertheless, the judge ordered him to be imprisoned in Beaver County Jail for over a year. Miller was opposed to even such a relatively short sentence and often escaped from prison, making him a wanted man in several states. When Miller and Floyd began working together, they often visited Mother Ash's house in Kansas City, where two young women, Beulah and Rose, who were connected to the sons of the house's owner, also lived. Floyd was infatuated with Beulah, the same girl who had called him Pretty Boy, and Miller was infatuated with her sister Rose. However, Beulah was married to William Ashe, and her sister Rose was married to the second brother, Walter, which of course created fertile ground for conflict. In March 1931, Floyd and Miller learned that the Ashe brothers were in trouble because of drug deals and were trying to get out of it by snitching. Floyd was afraid that the Ashe brothers would turn on them. It was too big a risk for a man wanted for bank robbery and escape, and it seems that Charlie decided to take matters into his own hands. On March 25th, around 8 p.m., Walter and William Ashe left their mother's house in their blue Chevrolet. The brothers told their family that they were going to listen to a radio show on 8th Street. However, Sadie Ashe did not believe them and later told the police that her sons had been tricked out of the house. According to Sadie, a woman had called William earlier that evening, and after that call, the brothers decided to leave. According to Sadie's neighbor, a little later she saw the Ashes' car followed by another car with Charlie Floyd and Bill Miller inside. Those were the brothers' final hours. On March 27th, their bodies were found in a ditch in rural Rossville, Kansas. The brothers were shot in the back of the head at close range. Their blue Chevrolet was found nearby, burned out. The police immediately suspected Charlie Floyd and Bill Miller of committing these brutal murders. Although Sadie Ashe, the mother of the murdered men, demanded justice, claiming she had received an anonymous threatening note from Floyd and Miller, no charges were ever filed, and the murder of the Ashe brothers remained unsolved. Meanwhile, Rose and Beulah, the wives of the murdered men, found solace in the arms of Billy and Charlie, respectively. Soon, the four set off on a journey, first to Oklahoma, then east through Arkansas and Kentucky. There's an unconfirmed rumor that Floyd and Miller robbed one Mount Zion deposit bank there of $2,000. Soon, Charlie and Miller, along with their new girlfriends, made it to Ohio. It's believed that the gangsters robbed a bank in White House of $1,600 and disappeared without a trace once again. The four traveled in a sedan with Missouri license plates. They soon aroused suspicion in downtown Bowling Green, where merchants and police had been watching the strangers for a week. Something about this cheerful, money-spending crew seemed suspicious to everyone. When the group showed up at the local bank for the second time on April 16, 1931, someone called the police. Bowling Green Police Chief Carl "Shorty" Gallagher and Officer Ralph Kastner responded to the call. They drove through the city center in a patrol car to survey the crime scene and assess the situation. The police drove slowly down Main Street and noticed two women looking at shop windows. A few minutes later, Charlie Floyd and Bill Miller joined Beulah and Rose. They were just about to go into the store to buy dresses for their ladies. As soon as Floyd saw the two cops get out of the patrol car with their guns drawn, he and Miller pulled out their pistols and a shootout ensued. Floyd managed to wound one of the officers, while Miller was shot and fell dead. Nearby, Beulah was shot in the head, while her sister managed to reach cover. Charlie continued shooting until his gun ran out of bullets. Then he rushed into the nearest alley and ran to where their car was parked. The police followed him, but Charlie was too fast. Law enforcement officers, reporters, and curious citizens gathered at the scene of the shooting. Miller, lying in a pool of blood, was covered with a sheet and taken to a local funeral home. Rose was taken into custody, and Beulah was given emergency medical attention. The next day, during intensive questioning of the Baird sisters, the police reconstructed the events. Newspapers across the country reported on the shootout, revealing the names of many of those involved. The mother of the Ashe brothers, who we already know, upon learning from Kansas City reporters about the Bowling Green shootout involving the Baird sisters and the suspects of her son's murders, first asked, "Did they catch Pretty Boy?" Her smile faded when she heard that he was still at large. The nickname Pretty Boy was new to most reporters, and they instantly latched onto it, including it in all subsequent articles about Charlie Floyd. At that moment, Charlie became synonymous with the nickname. The Baird sisters were detained and questioned about the recent bank robberies, but were eventually released due to lack of evidence. Meanwhile, in Ohio, the hunt was on for Pretty Boy Floyd, accused of killing a police officer. The Wood County Sheriff announced a $1,000 reward for his capture, adding that, quote, extreme caution should be exercised when approaching Floyd, as he will shoot without hesitation. The police believed that Floyd would try to hide with the Licavoli gang in Toledo, a notorious criminal group involved in bootlegging and racketeering in Detroit and Ohio. It was believed that Floyd had paid the gang for protection with some of the money he had obtained from bank heists in White House and Elliston. Thanks to widespread publicity, the search for Pretty Boy Floyd became a nationwide manhunt. Reports of his whereabouts came in from restaurants, movie theaters, and even churches. Floyd seemed to be everywhere at once. Due to the abundance of conflicting testimony, it's very difficult to determine Charlie's exact whereabouts that spring. By the summer of 1931, Floyd was mainly in Oklahoma and Missouri, earning a living by smuggling alcohol and caring for the recovering Beulah Baird. On July 20th, Kansas City police and federal agents raided a suspected liquor warehouse and found Charlie there. When the officers began searching the premises, Floyd slowly rose from behind a table. "Hey guys, do you know who this is?" one of the agents shouted. "That's Pretty Boy Floyd." Pretending to be drunk, Floyd staggered and suddenly threw something to the side, distracting the agents for a few seconds. That was enough time for him to grab a gun and rush for the door. A shootout took place, during which Floyd managed to break free and escape down the stairs, hiding in a parked Chrysler Plymouth. 5 people were wounded in the shootout, one of which died. This meant that the Kansas City police now had good reason to find Floyd. Remember that the same situation had already arisen with the police in Ohio, Missouri, Michigan, and Kentucky. Floyd found refuge in the hills of Oklahoma. He mostly lived with Bradley in Earlsboro, visiting his mother, brother, and sisters in Sequoyah County, as well as his ex-wife's relatives in Bixby, who always welcomed him, even after his divorce from Ruby. Charlie brought his ex-mother-in-law wildflowers and praised her cooking and gradually persuaded her to tell him where Ruby and his son were. Soon he headed to Coffeyville, Kansas, and met Ruby herself. His ex-wife had been following his adventures in the press and, of course, knew how risky it was to get involved with Floyd. But their rekindled love overcame all fears. Charlie was on cloud 9. He had reconciled with Ruby and reunited with his son, who was now 6 years old. The situation was clouded by one small problem, if you can call it that. Ruby had a new husband. This man was Leroy Leonard, a hard-working baker who had grown to love both Ruby and her son. When the unsuspecting Leonard came home and found his wife's ex-husband in the house, who was also a wanted criminal, he was naturally shocked. A fight broke out between him and Charlie, but Ruby managed to calm them down and prevent a brawl. By nightfall, Ruby and Dempsey had packed their things and left with Charlie, leaving Leroy alone. Floyd drove Ruby and her son to a rented house in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where they would enjoy a little more family time. However, Charlie never broke off his relationship with Beulah Baird, visiting her in secret from time to time. Charlie and Ruby introduced themselves to their neighbors as Jack and Ruby Hamilton. Their son had to go by the name Jackie Hamilton, and his parents spent a long time training him to respond to that name so that he wouldn't accidentally reveal their family secret. Dempsey/Jackie didn't mind. He didn't know who his father was, but he thought he was incredibly cool. He later remembered the time he spent living with Charlie and Ruby as one of the happiest periods of his childhood. Americans who read the newspapers would have never believed that the dangerous criminal and murderer, Charles Floyd, and the friendly family man, Jack Hamilton, were one and the same. Floyd took his son fishing, baked pies, and told jokes. At the same time, he did not stop robbing. By the end of the summer of 1931, Charlie had acquired a new permanent accomplice, George Birdwell. The duo made their debut on March 9, 1931, when they robbed a bank in Earlsboro, making off with about $3,000. This robbery took place shortly after Charlie and Miller returned to Kansas City, and a few weeks before the Ash brothers were murdered in Kansas. After that, Charlie and Birdwell went their separate ways, but now it was time to reunite. Although they were accused of more robberies than they actually committed, Chalk and Birdwell did rob 6 banks in Oklahoma over a 5-month period, from August to December 1931. On August 4th, they broke into the Citizens Bank in Shamrock, a town in Creek County, and made off with $400. The following month, they committed 2 more robberies. On September 8th, they stole $1,743 from the Morris State Bank, and on September 29th, they robbed the First National Bank in Maud of $3,850. The robbery in Maud was one of the most successful. Chalk and Birdwell, armed with a submachine gun and revolvers, entered and left the city with relative ease. Local police were almost certain that George Birdwell was one of the robbers, and bank employees identified the other when they saw a photograph of Charlie Floyd. The next day, Sequoyah County Sheriff George Cheek and other law officers ran into Charlie and Birdwell near Tulsa, where they were visiting Floyd's relatives. After a brief shootout, the suspects managed to escape. On October 14th, Charlie and Birdwell robbed another bank in Earlsboro, this time stealing $2,498. On November 5th, they took $2,500 from the First National Bank in Kanoa, and 6 weeks later, they visited Oklahoma County and took another $1,162 from a Morris State Bank. Charlie once joked to his wife's relatives that the bank had once refused to give him a loan to buy a ring for Ruby, so now he was happy to withdraw money from them. Charlie and Birdwell's method of robbery was similar. They would arrive in a small town during the day and head straight for the bank. While their driver kept the engine running, Floyd and Birdwell would enter the bank and announce their intentions without wearing masks or hiding in any way. Charlie was always dressed in a suit and tie. His shoes were polished and his hair was slicked back. Perhaps he felt that he had to maintain the pretty boy image that the press had created for him. Birdwell, on the other hand, was disguised by his cowboy hat and boots. After taking the money, they drove away with 2 or 3 hostages from among the bank employees, whom they forced to ride on the running boards of the car so that police would not shoot at them. Most witnesses claimed that the gangsters tried to avoid gunfights and violence. By early 1932, the legend of Pretty Boy Floyd had become one of the most popular in the country. Floyd could no longer keep up with his fame. It became increasingly common for him to spend the whole day with his family and then read in the newspapers about robberies he had allegedly committed during that time. For example, on January 14th, according to the media, Floyd participated in 2 robberies in different cities, which was a clear overestimation of his abilities. In reality, he and Birdwell robbed one bank in Castle and had no part in the robbery that took place a little later in Payton. During the first week of January 1932, while government agents and sheriff's deputies were searching the countryside for Pretty Boy and his accomplices, Charlie quietly took his wife and son out of Fort Smith and moved to Tulsa. He rented a frame bungalow in a pleasant residential neighborhood not far from downtown. Soon, reports began to come into the police that Floyd and Birdwell had been seen in town. Detectives and patrolmen combed the areas where Pretty Boy had last been spotted. And in the second week of February 1932, just after Charlie's 28th birthday, all hell broke loose. First, on February 7th, the police encountered Floyd and Birdwell on the street. A shootout began between the criminals and law enforcement, resulting in one officer being wounded and Floyd and Birdwell escaping. On February 10th, the Tulsa police and the outlaws clashed in a second round, which also ended with the escape of the notorious duo. About an hour after the shootout, a car believed to belong to the criminals was found abandoned. Investigators then went to a garage and then to Floyd's home on East Young Street, thanks to a tag found on the battery of the abandoned car. At around 5 a.m. on February 11th, 24 armed officers, led by Detective Sergeant Lon Elliott, arrived in the area and surrounded Charlie's rented home. Fearing that Floyd and Birdwell would shoot, the police were heavily armed with shotguns and rifles, carried a large supply of tear gas, and had an armored truck. When the squad of armed detectives approached the house, Ruby and her young son came out through the front door and disappeared into the neighborhood. Floyd and Birdwell were supposed to remain inside. The police surrounded the house and prepared for a raid. Then, a tear gas grenade was thrown through one of the windows. However, no sound came from inside the house. Soon, an employee of the American Bankers Association who was nearby walked around the block and informed the sergeant that Floyd and Birdwell had quietly left the house through the back door. The operation was a failure. However, the police managed to arrest Floyd's ex-wife and their son at a bus station in the city center a few hours after the failed raid. Ruby initially refused to give her real name, introducing herself as Hamilton. and claiming that she had arrived from Oklahoma City on January 5th and that her husband had joined her for 2 weeks, after which she had not seen him again. A search of the home revealed numerous newspaper clippings detailing Floyd's crimes, as well as recent Tulsa newspaper articles about 2 shootouts with police in the city. When officers showed Dempsey a photo of Pretty Boy Floyd used in the magazine, the boy immediately recognized him and loudly boasted that the cool guy in the picture was his father. Having obtained initial confirmation of Floyd's identity, the police continued to talk to Dempsey, who naively told them that his father often hung out with George Birdwell, that he always had a lot of money, and that he read a lot of newspapers. Ruby realized that there was no point in playing games anymore and admitted her identity, refusing to share any additional information. Ruby and her son spent the night in jail under heavy watch, and on Saturday, February 13th, after more than 36 hours, they were released. Mother and son were taken home, where police officers helped Ruby tidy up the house, which had been ransacked during the search. Surveillance of the house on East Young Street was discontinued, but Floyd was not stupid enough to return there. He and Birdwell spent the rest of the winter and spring on the move. During this period, one of the few confirmed murders committed by Pretty Boy Floyd took place. It was on April 9, 1932. Retired Oklahoma Sheriff Irv A. Kelly and a group of law enforcement officers ambushed Floyd on a farm near Bixby, where his wife's family lived and where Ruby and Dempsey were staying that night. According to the information received, this was the place they met with Floyd. At some point, Irv Kelly separated from the others and encountered Floyd, who had driven up to the house and bullets were shot. According to Charlie's later confession, it was a situation where only one of them could survive, and Floyd was the one who made it. Irv Kelly died at the scene, but Pretty Boy also took a beating. 4 bullets from the retired sheriff hit him. 1 grazed his scrotum, and the rest hit his legs. After that, Birdwell helped him get to the car and drive away. They stopped in Earlsboro, where a doctor they knew helped Floyd. And on April 21st, 12 days after Kelly's murder, Floyd and Birdwell robbed the First State Bank in Stonewall, Oklahoma. By the summer of 1932, the story of Charlie Floyd's exploits had reached even greater heights. Charlie's continued success in evading justice drove law enforcement agencies in the Midwest crazy. They were at a dead end in their pursuit of Pretty Boy Floyd. Most of the leads turned out to be exaggerated or false. On November 1st, 1932, after committing 2 robberies in Birdwell's hometown of Earlsboro, Charlie and George decided it would be a good idea to visit Floyd's side of the country, Tulsa. And while they were at it, they would rob the state bank. They were joined by a new member of the team, an 18-year-old Australian named Elliot, a guy who was not very experienced but capable. This was perhaps the most spectacular robbery in Floyd's long list. But before we talk about it, let's clarify how ordinary citizens, not politicians and law enforcement officers, but workers, farmers, and housewives, saw Pretty Boy Floyd. Charles Floyd was talked about almost as often as the weather. Children playing cops and robbers fought over the role of Pretty Boy Floyd. It was not everyone, but many secretly supported Charles. In the 1930s, the country was going through difficult times, and the public was hungry for exciting stories, especially about heroes who stood up against the harsh reality. Hollywood gangster films such as Little Caesar and The Public Enemy were hugely successful. During this period of social unrest, Charlie Floyd became a kind of anti-hero, symbolizing justice for those who had been denied it. Charlie was called the Robin Hood of the South for his generosity toward the poor, and rumors circulated that he got rid of mortgage loans during his bank robberies. As far as we can tell, these rumors are not entirely unfounded. Now we return to the robbery in Tulsa, and you'll understand the reason for this digression. To begin with, the heist was no secret. Chalk's relatives and friends knew about it. Charlie's grandfather, Charles Murphy Floyd, even came from Aikens to watch his grandson, so to speak. He and his friends waited for Charlie near the train station, discussing the drought, the depression, and politics. Upon arriving in Tulsa, Chalk and his accomplices drove up to the bank. Before getting down to business, Floyd went to a nearby barber shop, greeted his acquaintances, and told them in no uncertain terms that he and his friends were about to rob the local bank. Charlie's buddies reacted like a cheerleading squad at a football game. One of his friends shouted, "Give 'em hell!" Only the assistant teller Bob Riggs was in the bank, so Charlie and George didn't have to work too hard. While the gangsters were collecting the money, customers even came into the bank, who Charlie greeted and asked to remain calm. After collecting $2,530, Floyd and Birdwell took the assistant teller hostage so that no one would stop them from escaping. Elliott started the car and they drove away, only 5 blocks from the bank where Riggs was able to jump out. As they drove off, Charlie said goodbye to him. At that time, Police Chief Burt Cotton, who was nearby, did not notice anything suspicious. Grandpa Floyd, by the way, missed the robbery, as he was caught up in conversation with his friends. Rumors circulated in Sallisaw that Charlie had robbed the bank to pay for the medical treatment of 2 friends who had been injured in a clash with police, but there's no confirmation of this. Through intermediaries, Charlie gave part of the money to Ruby, who, together with Dempsey, moved in with her family. There, the boy went to school and helped his grandfather and uncles on the farm. Just 2 days later, Charlie Floyd took part in another seemingly absurd event. He gave an interview. An ambitious journalist named Vivian Brown, who dreamed of writing a biography of the famous Pretty Man himself, spent a long time talking to his friends and relatives, begging them to arrange a meeting with him. Finally, her request was passed on to Charlie in writing, and he agreed. On November 3rd, around 4 p.m., Brown returned home from business school in Muskogee, where she was taking shorthand lessons and saw a stranger waiting for her in a car. They drove more than 30 miles along back roads and stopped at a grove of walnut trees. There was a brown Ford sitting there. A young man in an elegant suit, a white shirt, and tie got out of the car. Vivian Brown recognized him immediately. It was Charlie Floyd. For several hours, Charlie answered the reporter's questions, telling her about his life from childhood to the present. Throughout the interview, Floyd was polite and consistent, except when asked about the number of banks he had robbed. At first, he said 32. Then he said there were more than 60, which was a clear exaggeration. Although the journalist never wrote a book about Floyd, she did prepare a newspaper series about criminals. In articles published in the Oklahoma News in 1934, Brown wrote that Floyd's image as a modern Robin Hood was confirmed by many facts. Like the famous robber from the English forests, he took money from the banks and shared it with the poor. But the more people talked about Floyd, the fiercer his pursuers became. Reward notices for his capture or death appeared everywhere. Now Charlie didn't think it was a game. He was desperate. In November, Governor Murray admitted to reporters that Floyd had twice sent word through relatives that he would surrender if he were saved from the electric chair, but the bandit was refused. Later, Eugene Ham, secretary of the Oklahoma Bar Association, stated the authorities' intentions toward criminals even more openly. Quote, "We urge bankers throughout the state to inform residents of their cities that we do not want to take these gangsters alive." Charlie had no way out. The police were chasing him everywhere, and on November 21st, they caught up with George Birdwell. That day, the Tulsa police learned that Ruby Floyd had been discharged from the hospital, where she had recently undergone surgery. Law enforcers were waiting for her ex-husband to show up while on duty near the hospital. Floyd himself was in Kansas City at the time, but news that Ruby had recovered and needed money to pay for medical expenses reached Birdwell in Earlsboro. Though Birdwell knew Ruby well, he couldn't help her. He decided to rob the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Boley, a small town in Okfuskee County, and quickly found 2 accomplices. But the robbery failed. One of the bank employees got into the vault where a rifle was hidden and shot Birdwell in the back. Floyd's friend died almost immediately. Ruby checked out of the hospital, paying the medical bills with her father's money. Soon she, along with Birdwell's wife and children, and 50 other mourners, arrived at George's funeral. Incidentally, legend has it that Charlie Floyd also went to say goodbye to his friend. Some men say that they saw Pretty Boy in women's clothing and with a veil over his head, crying over Birdwell's coffin. One lady from Morris, Oklahoma, said that Floyd borrowed her mother's clothes for Birdwell's funeral and swore that she had a photograph of him wearing a dress, but unfortunately, it had gone missing. In reality, this was most likely a fabrication. Of course, Charlie was deeply saddened by Birdwell's death, but showing up at his funeral, which was being watched by the police, would have been suicide. In the summer of 1933, thanks to the efforts of the FBI and the press, a dark shadow fell over Charlie's Robin Hood reputation. On June 17th, a terrible shootout took place at the main entrance to Union Station in Kansas City, killing 5 men, including an FBI agent. This at the time was the second most shocking event for the public after the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. It was not possible to determine the perpetrators with certainty. However, based on scant evidence and vague eyewitness accounts, Hoover and the Kansas City authorities pinned the blame for the mass murder on Pretty Boy Floyd, who probably had nothing to do with it. Charlie spent most of the first 6 months of 1933 in Cookson Hills and the oil patch around Earlsboro. After George Birdwell's death, Floyd contacted Adam Richetti, the last of many companions, to travel with Pretty Boy. Charlie was always on the move, but in 1932 and 33, he spent a lot of time with the Ringos, Ruby's aunt and uncle, who had a house near Boynton in Muskogee County. In May 1933, Charlie visited his mother in Sallisaw. He took her to Aikens to decorate the graves of family members and friends. Apparently, Charlie was in a bad mood at the time, to say the least, because at the end, he pointed out to Mamie the spot next to his father's grave where he wanted to be buried. On June 14th, another bloody incident occurred, in which Floyd was again falsely accused. At 2 p.m., 3 unknown men robbed the Farmers and Merchants Bank in the town of Mexico, Missouri, and fled. Shortly after the robbery, the county sheriff and a sergeant stopped a suspicious car on the outskirts of Columbia, Missouri, to question the driver and passengers, and were shot dead. Several days after the murders, the suspects were not found, but a woman named Lucy Clark claimed to have witnessed the patrolman's murder. Mrs. Clark described the driver of the car in detail, and when shown a picture of Floyd, she confirmed that it was him. However, her testimony was later found to be erroneous. Floyd, as researchers believed, was not in the town of Mexico on that day, and the man described by Mrs. Clark had to have been significantly larger than Pretty Boy. In September 1933, with murder charges hanging over them, Charlie Floyd and his buddy Adam Richetti said goodbye to their loved ones and headed east with Beulah and Rose Baird, making a few stops in Ohio. When they got to Buffalo, New York, the couples rented a small apartment under fake names. This place became their home for the next 13 months. Their living expenses were covered by money accumulated from previous heists. The criminals and their companions rarely left the city, limiting themselves to occasional trips to the store. Life in Buffalo was routine and secluded. In the fall of 1934, Floyd decided to return home, both because of dwindling financial resources and because the myth of his involvement in the Union Station massacre had been partially dispelled. On October 18th, Floyd gave Rose Baird his last $600 and asked her to buy a new Ford. At around 3 a.m., on October 19th, the pair left Buffalo in his car. Their destination was the South, where they could seek refuge with other outlaws. But the trip did not go as planned. Early on Saturday morning, due to thick fog and slippery roads, Chalk lost control of the car near Wellsville, Ohio, and crashed into a telephone pole. None of the passengers were injured, but the car was badly damaged. Fearing they'd be found, Floyd instructed the Baird sisters to take the car to Wellsville for repairs and come back for him and Richetti. When their companions left, Floyd and Richetti built a fire and waited. But local residents noticed them and called Wellsville Police Chief John H. Foles, who drove out with his deputies to check on the suspicious men. Approaching the robbers, Foles introduced himself as a worker on his way to a brick factory. Although he was not wearing a uniform, Pretty Boy quickly figured out who he was, and a shootout ensued between the fugitives and Foles. Richetti was quickly detained as his weapon was out of order, but Floyd managed to get away. In search of shelter, he knocked on one Theodore Peterson's door and asked for $10 to take him to nearby Youngstown. George McMullen, who was visiting the house, seized the chance to make a quick $10, which was a lot of money by Great Depression standards, and agreed. Everything was going well. Frightened by the sight of the machine gun, McMullen drove Pretty Boy through the country roads without stopping. But then, for the second time in a day, a vehicle had quit on Floyd. McMullen's Ford ran out of fuel and stalled. Charlie had to go to the nearest house again. Finding a man named James Baum there, he forced him to start his car and drive on with him. While Floyd was struggling with his car troubles, his identity had been established in Wellsville. When Baum's car approached the outskirts of the village of Lisbon, officers were already waiting for them. Shots were fired, which, due to the general commotion, witnesses remembered differently. When the smoke from the shots cleared, Charlie Floyd had disappeared. Armed with 2 Colt .45 automatic pistols, he crawled under the nearest fence and disappeared into a dense forest known as Spence's Woods. Despite the pouring rain, troops combed the area in search of the fugitive, but after 2 days, they had nothing to show for their efforts. Some of the sheriff's deputies and police officers believed that Floyd had been mortally wounded in the shootout and was now dead. In reality, Charlie was alive and unharmed. He spent 2 days and 2 nights wandering through the hills, feeding on nuts and fruits from abandoned orchards. But on October 22nd, hunger forced Floyd to return to civilization. At noon, Charlie reached Robert Robinson's farm. The farmer's daughter, Mabel Wilson, offered him a wash and treated him to ginger cookies and apples. Shortly after Charlie left, Constable Clyde Birch arrived at the farm. Upon learning of the visitor and receiving a description, he realized that it was Pretty Boy Floyd. A police squad was immediately dispatched in hot pursuit. While the lawmen were searching for him, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Floyd appeared at the farm of widow Ellen Conkle. Here, following the rural customs of hospitality, the mistress could not refuse the request of an unknown vagrant and provided him with a full meal. Then, when Mrs. Conkle's brother returned from the field, they agreed to give Floyd a ride to Clarkson. As they were driving away, 2 police vehicles passed by. Seeing them, Floyd immediately realized he was in trouble. He had to jump out of the car and run across the nearest pasture. 8 federal agents and policemen followed him. Convinced they were dealing with Pretty Boy Floyd, the officers started shooting. This is how one of the participants in the chase described what happened next. One shot hit Floyd's arm and knocked the gun out of his hand. The second shot hit him in the side and knocked him down. The pursuers ran up to Floyd, who was lying on the ground. They helped him sit up under an apple tree and tried to question him about the Kansas City massacre. But Floyd refused to tell them anything. According to eyewitnesses, the last dialogue between Charlie and one of the feds went as follows. "Are you Pretty Boy Floyd? I'm Charles Arthur Floyd." "But you're Floyd, aren't you?" "I'm Floyd." At 4:25 p.m., 30-year-old Charles Arthur Floyd had died. As if afraid that his corpse would run away, the police handcuffed him and tied his legs. Melvin Purvis, who led the operation, called J. Edgar Hoover and reported the capture of yet another public enemy. The body was taken to a funeral home, and there are a couple of moments in this event that are of interest to us. First, the police tore Floyd's jacket into pieces and divided them among themselves, like fans who had gotten their hands on the clothes of a famous singer or actor. Second, note the entry in the funeral book made during the examination of the body. 4 wounds, shot in the stomach. If you listen carefully to the description of Floyd's arrest, you should now have some questions. Where did the 2 stomach wounds that led to his death come from? Version number 1. The 2 bullets that the witness to the operation failed to mention hit the criminal in the side while he was trying to escape. Thus, he was already mortally wounded. Version number 2. Melvin Purvis, who led the arrest, ordered his subordinate to execute Floyd on the spot. This version was presented in 1979 by Chester Smith, an 84-year-old retired police captain. Well, it's up to you to decide which version is true. Charlie Floyd's funeral was the largest in Oklahoma history, gathering between 20,000 and 40,000 people on October 28th, an unusually hot autumn day. Charlie was buried in Aikens, in the cemetery he had chosen a year earlier. The coffin was placed in a hearse, followed by a 3-mile procession of cars, trucks, and wagons. Many walked to see the coffin lowered into the ground. Some people celebrated, but most mourned sincerely, especially Floyd's friends from Oklahoma. To them, Charles was never the ruthless gangster Pretty Boy Floyd, portrayed by the press. He was still Chalk, the good old guy from the farm.